When you think of the most powerful economy in the world, you might think of the United States, which is the largest economy, accounting for almost a quarter of global GDP. Or you might think of China, which has 1.4 billion people and is rapidly developing. But there is one, much smaller country, which has a much greater influence over the world economy than either of these two superpowers. The most economically powerful in the world is a small desert nation with a population roughly the size of California. If you haven't guessed it already, we're talking about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia spans the majority of the Arabian Peninsula, making it the largest country in the world by landmass. It has a harsh desert climate with extreme temperatures and limited capacity for agriculture. It appears inhospitable, and for many centuries it remained a sparsely populated nation whose economy relied on subsistence agriculture. But this all changed in the second half of the 1900s, when the economy started booming and the country developed into a global superpower. This development can be entirely attributed to oil. In the 1930s, John D. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, started oil exploration in Saudi Arabia under a joint venture with the Saudi government. After a few years of fruitless search, Standard Oil sold its stake in the company to another American company called Texaco, as well as the predecessors to ExxonMobil. Using the American geologist's technical expertise, they eventually found oil in the city of Dhahran in 1938. It produced 1,500 barrels per day, which was small even for the time. But this discovery proved there were untapped oil reserves in the country. Saudi King Abdulaziz redoubled his investment in oil exploration. This decision would drastically alter the fate of his nation. In 1944, they changed the name of the operation to the Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco for short. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Aramco continued to find more and more reserves. In 1951, they discovered the Safaniya oil field, which was the largest offshore oil field in the world. In 1957, they discovered the world's largest onshore oil field in the Ghawar region. As it turns out, Saudi Arabia has the second largest oil reserves in the world, which are worth a mind-boggling $34 trillion. While Venezuela later discovered oil reserves even larger than Saudi Arabia's, their oil is more difficult to refine, so it is much less valuable than Saudi's more pure oil. The Saudi king saw the tremendous potential of the country's oil and purchased 100% control in Aramco from the American partners. As Aramco's oil production soared, it became extremely profitable. The government used the profits to rapidly develop the country's economy. But there was a downside to this. Oil prices are extremely volatile, and the country would suffer severe recessions every time they dipped. At the time, the majority of oil production was controlled by the so-called Seven Sisters, which were comprised of American and European-based multinational oil companies. These companies were so massive, they could unilaterally tank world prices if they increased production. Many oil exporting countries were unhappy with the Seven Sisters' dominance. So the Saudis thought of an idea. If all the oil exporting countries could coordinate their production together, they could offset production changes of the Seven Sisters and thus control global oil prices. In 1960, Saudi Arabian officials met in Baghdad with representatives of other oil-producing countries, including Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. They created the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC for short. They continued to sign on new countries, and by 1970, OPEC controlled more than half of the world's oil production. They immediately started reducing output to increase prices, and thus increase the profits of producing nations. As the world's largest oil producer, Saudi Arabia became the de facto leader of the organization. The kingdom now found itself wielding an immense amount of power. With OPEC, they had the ability to set the price of oil to almost any level they desired. This power was not just economic, but also political. In October of 1973, a coalition of Arab countries, including Egypt and Syria, invaded Israeli-occupied territory as part of a long-standing border dispute. The United States and other Western countries aided Israel by supplying military hardware and advisors. The Israeli military had superior technology, and the war ended with a ceasefire agreement less than a month after the fighting started. But the interference of Western powers on the side of Israel angered the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia thought it would be the perfect time to test the powers of OPEC in a geopolitical context. Shortly after the war ended, the Arab nations within OPEC drastically reduced production and put an embargo on US imports. While the US did have domestic supply, they imported a significant portion of their oil from OPEC members. Within just a few months, the local price of oil in the US surged from $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel. This led to severe shortages across the country. Gas stations were forced to ration their limited supply, and long lines at the pump became a common occurrence. This caused chaos in Western nations, with the US closing gas stations on Sundays and many European countries restricting non-essential vehicle travel. Even after the embargo was lifted in 1974, inflation expectations had risen, leading to a decade-long period of stagflation. New Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker was forced to raise interest rates sharply, which plunged the world economy into a deep, multi-year recession. This shows the power of Saudi Arabia's dominant position in OPEC. With the embargo, they created a massive recession in the US economy, which was 30 times larger than their own. With the rise of electric vehicles and renewable energy sources, there is a perception that oil is becoming less important, and thus the power of Saudi Arabia will diminish. While oil demand was hampered in 2020 due to the pandemic, global oil consumption has been steadily increasing every year before this. As poor countries develop, more people can afford cars and air travel, which boosts oil demand. This more than offsets the gradual transition to electric vehicles in developed countries. The average person in India consumes the equivalent of 51 gallons of oil per year. The average person in the US consumes the equivalent of 930 gallons. The average person in Singapore consumes the equivalent of more than 3,000 gallons per year. As developing countries become richer, their oil consumption will increase by orders of magnitude. India alone could eventually consume more oil than all of the US and Europe combined within a few decades. Many analysts expect global oil demand to continue increasing until 2045, despite the rise in renewable energy. This means Saudi Arabia will continue to have a dominant economic and political position for decades to come. In 2019, Aramco IPO'd on the Saudi Stock Exchange, raising a record $29 billion. Currently, the company has a market cap of $1.8 trillion, making it the third most valuable company in the world after just Microsoft and Apple. Notably, it is the only non-US company in the top 6. But oil demand will eventually peak. Saudi Arabia knows they need to diversify away from the commodity if they are to have sustained economic growth over the next century. That's why they raised money by selling shares of Aramco in the IPO. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on their Vision 2030 initiative, which aims to develop the country's healthcare, education, recreation, and tourism sectors. While the success of Vision 2030 is far from certain, Aramco will allow Saudi Arabia to maintain its position as a global superpower for decades to come. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Saudi Arabia? Let us know in the comment section below. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future uploads. As always, thank you for watching and we'll see you on the next one.